All right, folks. If you were in class, you know that there was a point where my computer shut down because my power cord failed me, and uh, and so I lost the first 15, 20 minutes of this lecture. So I'm re-recording it for you, and then I'm going to edit it together with the part that I actually recorded in class. So uh, know that. But the whole lecture is going to be here in this video, so nothing to worry about. All the information will be clear. So I'll just jump right into it. I'll skip all the start of class minutia. Well, I will start by just kind of taking us back to where we started and then bringing us to where we're at. So, chapter 1, we studied the basic principles that underlie the basic approach to economics. And then chapter 2, we jumped into understanding the main tool that embodies the approach of economics, which is the model, right? So the simplification of reality that allows us to study whatever phenomena we're interested in studying. We looked at the production possibility frontier, and then the comparative advantage model, which builds on the production possibility frontier in the last chapter. And in that chapter, that model was used to highlight the nature of the fact that there are gains from trade, right? If folks specialize in what they're good at, then and they just produce that, and then they trade with others that are good at other things, then there could be more of everything for everybody. And the model highlights that. The model is an old model. It was created by David Ricardo, I think, in the 18th century. So it's been around for a while, and the insights are still relevant to this day. So make sure you understand that model. Make sure you understand how the graphs work, how to calculate the opportunity cost, what comparative advantage is versus the absolute advantage, and why it benefits one country to trade, and it benefits, and the reason is if they have a comparative advantage, meaning they have a lower opportunity cost, then and everybody specializes, then there can be benefits from trade. Also, we looked at the circular flow model, so kind of just understand that generally, understand that money flows in one direction, goods flow in the other direction within the economy, from households to firms, as households and firms interact in goods and services and factor markets. All right, now we're going to jump into the workhorse model, the main model that's used in economics to study markets. So we're going to look at the supply and demand model. It's a model of a competitive market. A competitive market is a market in which you have a lot of sellers and a lot of buyers, and no seller nor buyer has any leverage over the market, meaning that they have to just accept what the market is doing. So they can't try to raise the price. They can't try to lower the price. They basically just have to submit to what the market is setting and then operate within it. If the price is meeting the cost of suppliers, they're going to supply in there. If not, they can't do anything about the price, so they won't supply. As far as buyers go, if the price is not something that they're willing to pay because they don't value the good enough, then they won't be part of the market. They won't buy in the market. And what is being sold in a competitive market is generally a very generic good. There's nothing that a firm can do to make their own version of the good. So we're talking about very, very generic things that we call commodities, like oil, wheat, steel, cotton. Money can also be thought of as a commodity that a competitive market will allocate properly, meaning it'll get it to those that value it the most. And this is in contrast to less competitive markets. So this, ultimately, we're going to call it the perfectly competitive market when we get into the production side of the market, which will be in the second part of the course. And it embodies the extreme end of the competitive spectrum that a firm can operate in. It can either operate in the most competitive setting possible, which is a competitive market, or in the least competitive setting possible, which is a monopoly, where you only have one seller. They have complete control over what is being sold, and they have complete control over the price. And then, of course, there's in-between cases, which we'll talk about later. So anyway, so the model of supply and demand represents a competitive market. So just understand it for that. So we'll look at the demand side, we'll look at the supply side, and then we'll look at the interaction of supply and demand that leads to an equilibrium, sort of a resting place for the market, where the market is doing the best it can do, and nobody can do anything better than what is being done under that equilibrium, which is embodied by a price that everybody's in agreement about and a quantity that everybody's in agreement about. And then we'll look at what happens to that equilibrium when there's a change in supply or demand. And then we'll look at, and then we'll just briefly talk about a competitive market and other markets. Basically what I just talked about at the beginning when I talked about competitive markets and how they're different than monopolies and how they're different than the in-between cases, which again, we'll talk about later. All right, supply and demand. Again, we're going to learn what a competitive market is, how it is described by supply and demand model, what a demand curve is, what a supply curve is, what's the difference between movements along a curve and a shift of the curve, how do supply and demand curves determine a market's equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, if there's a shortage or surplus, how does price move the market back to equilibrium? All right, so let's talk about the model of a competitive market, supply and demand. A market is a place where buyers and sellers trade goods and services. Anytime that you've bought something, you've been part of a market. A lot of people literally think of the market, right, the grocery store that they buy food at. But again, any situation that involves buying and selling is a market. So even if it's like in the digital sphere, right, even if it's online, when you're buying stuff from Amazon or people are buying and selling stocks online, those are markets. A competitive market has many buyers and sellers of the same good or service, none of whom can influence the price of which the good or service is sold. And the supply and demand model is a model of how a competitive market behaves. So you've seen a version of this at some point in your life in which you have a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. They meet at the middle. They establish an equilibrium for the market. The equilibrium is made up of the price and the quantity. All right, moving forward, I'm going to explain all of everything I just said. Don't worry if you don't remember anything from having covered this in high school at some point. I'm going to cover it again right now. All right, so demand. Let's talk about the curve itself. So the curve represents the information embodied in a demand schedule, which is just a table showing how much of a good or service consumers will buy at different prices. So here at a price of $1, people are willing to buy 100. At a price of $2, they're willing to buy 80, $3, $60, $4, 40, etc. So what this is basically telling us is that as the price is increasing, the quantity demanded is decreasing. And it reflects what's called the law of demand. A higher price for a good or service, other things equal, leads people to demand a smaller quantity of that good or service. It's just, it's very basic sort of intuition about how demand works, right? Like you're going to buy more of something if it's cheaper than if it's more expensive, is basically what the law of demand says. The quantity demanded is the actual amount of a good or service consumers are willing to buy at any given price. So at $2, the quantity demanded is 80. At $4, the quantity demanded is 40. So the information from the table can be converted into a set of coordinates on the XY plane. So again, the XY plane is where we have our graphs, right? You're going to have a variable on the x-axis, the flat horizontal plane, and then a variable on the y-axis, the vertical plane, the vertical axis, and together they make this plane, this XY plane. The information from the quantity demanded column is going to be on the x-axis, while the information in the price column is going to be on the y-axis. And together they're going to make a demand curve, a graphical representation of the demand schedule. It shows the relationship between quantity demanded and price. So here we're talking about the market for cotton. You've got the price of cotton on the y-axis and the quantity of cotton on the x-axis. And here we're going to see a demand schedule for cotton, and as each point pops up, we're going to plot it. So here's the first one. The price of cotton is $2 per pound. That means that 7.1 billion pounds are purchased. So we can plot that point there. Next one, $1.75, price goes down, quantity demanded goes up to 7.5. So 1.75, 7.5 is this point here that corresponds to this price quantity pair. And we can go all the way to the end of our demand schedule to plot the entire set of points, which we can then connect and therefore draw our demand curve. Now, the demand curve you can see is moving downward like this as we increase quantity demanded and also as we lower price. Again, reflecting the fact that as price goes down, quantity demanded increases. It reflects the law of demand. So that's our downward sloping demand curve. Now, it's important to be able to describe a movement along the curve, so moving from one point on the curve to another versus a shift of the entire curve. So if something is affecting the demand other than the price of the actual good we're talking about, then that's going to shift the entire relationship. So let's say we're talking about this demand curve here, and we're looking at this point here, where at $1 people are willing to buy 10 units. Let's say incomes go up in the economy, so people have more money. That means at $1, they're going to be willing to buy more than 10. Let's say they're going to be willing to buy 15. That happens at every single price. And so, therefore, we can make a whole new set of points to the right of this curve, representing the fact that at every price, people are willing to buy more. And if we connect those points, we get a shifted demand curve. So when the demand curve shifts, again, because something other than price is affecting demand, then we say we have a change in demand. That's how we describe it. We need to be able to describe that in contrast to just a movement along the curve. So, excuse me. If we move to the second case over here, we have once again a demand curve. We have this point. Well, let me just go to this definition that just popped up here. So again, here we're talking about a change in demand, which corresponds to a shift of the curve. A shift of the demand curve is a change in the quantity demanded at any given price represented by the shift of the original demand curve to a new position. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a change in demand. We're talking about a shift of the demand curve versus a change in quantity demanded where, okay, so once again, we're looking at this point here. At $1, people are willing to buy 10. Let's say all of a sudden the price is halved. For whatever reason, maybe suppliers have lowered the price to 50 cents per unit. We know that as the price goes down, people buy more. So we're just gonna move down along the curve because the one thing that's affecting demand right now is price. And so therefore, we're gonna go to this point here that corresponds to that price of 50 cents and an increased quantity demanded of 14.2. So we say that quantity demanded increased in this case. There was a change in quantity demanded because there was a change in price. And we moved down along the demand curve because of it. So a movement along the demand curve is a change in the quantity demanded of a good arising from a change in the good's price. Remember, the curve itself embodies the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So if price is changing, we're just moving along that curve versus something else affecting demand, which shifts the entire curve like we saw in the first case here on the left. So once again, if we're looking at a decrease in demand at any given price, people are buying less and the curve will shift to the left. And there's two ways to look at it. One is you can think there's a lower willingness to pay for the same quantity. So before at 7 units, people were willing to pay $2, but now they're willing to pay a little bit less than $1. The other way to look at it is that at any given price, people are buying less. So at this price over here of $1, people are willing to buy 8, and now they're willing to buy a little less than 7. So there's just two ways to look at it as far as like what's happening with price and quantity. But as far as like what's actually happening with the entire relationship, we know that the curve has shifted. There has been a decrease in demand. And of course, if the curve shifts to the right, there is an increase in demand. So again, there's two ways to look at it. That means that at any given price, greater quantity demanded is demanded at that price. So at $1 before, people were willing to buy 10. Now they're willing to buy 15. Or you can say that at the quantity of 10, people were willing to pay $1, but now they're willing to pay more than $1 because the demand has shifted. All right, so let's look at the things that do shift the demand curve, and there's mainly five of them. Even though there are more, these are the main ones that we'll talk about in this class. So the principal factors that change demand for any good are changes in the price of related goods or services, changes in income, changes in taste, changes in expectations, and changes in the number of consumers. So let's consider each of them in turn, one at a time. So again, in contrast to the effect of the price change, which only changes the quantity demanded, right? You have to be very specific about what we're saying. Price changes quantity demanded. A change in any of the other factors will change demand. So let's talk about the first effect, which is a change in the price of related goods or services. So the change in the price of related goods or services basically can take the form of two cases. The first one is the case of substitutes. So two goods are substitutes if a rise in the price of one good leads to an increase in the demand for the other good. Essentially, think about Coke and Pepsi. Like, you like Coca-Cola, but Pepsi's pretty much close to that, right? So they're substitutes for you. Like, you'll take either one. But for now, initially you're drinking Coke. All of a sudden the price of Coke goes up. That means your quantity demanded of Coke will decrease, right? In the market for Coke, you will move along the demand curve and you will decrease the quantity demanded of Coke because you're buying because the price has gone up. As you decrease your quantity demanded of Coke, you will substitute Pepsi for the Coke you drink, right? Because Pepsi remains at a lower price relatively. So at any given price in the Pepsi market, demand will increase, will shift to the right, because it's not price that's causing people to drink more Pepsi. It's the fact that the substitute's price has gone up, and now people are buying more of Pepsi because they're buying less of Coke. They're substituting away from Coke to Pepsi. So again, substitutes are usually goods that in some way serve a similar function, like coffee and tea, muffins and donuts, train rides and air flights. A rise in the price of the alternative good induces some consumers to purchase the original good instead of it shifting the demand for the original good to the right. Sometimes a rise in the price of one good makes consumers less willing to buy another good, and that takes us to the second possible case of a related good that could affect demand in a market, shifting the entire demand curve. That's the case of complements, things that are bought together. So two goods are complements if the rise in the price of one good leads to a decrease in the demand for the other good. So think about peanut butter and jelly. In the US, culturally speaking, people prefer to eat peanut butter with jelly. So if the price of peanut butter goes up, the quantity demanded of peanut butter will go down. Since people buy jelly with peanut butter, when the price of peanut butter goes up, then demand for jelly will go down. At any given price in the jelly market, people are going to buy less. Why? Because they buy the two together. They're complements. And because the price of peanut butter has gone up, leading to a decrease in the quantity demanded of peanut butter, people are now demanding less jelly as well. And so the change in demand in the jelly market has nothing to do with the price of jelly. It has everything to do with the price of the complement, which result in a decrease in demand in the jelly market. So again, complements are usually goods that in some sense are consumed together, like computers and software, cappuccinos and cookies, cars and gasoline. Because consumers like to consume a good and its complement together, when the price of one good rises, the demand for its complement decreases, shifting the demand for the complement to the left. All right, the next big shifter of demand is income. So the effect of changes in income on demand depend on the nature of the good in question. There's two possible cases for what could happen when incomes change with respect to demand. If you have a normal good, what we call a normal good in economics, then demand increases when income increases and vice versa. Demand will decrease when income decreases. So here you see like a fine cut of meat, right? Not everybody eats meat, but if you're a meat eater, it's likely that as your income goes up, you're going to buy finer cuts of meat versus if your income goes down, you're going to buy, not as great cuts of meat. So that's a normal good. And that's in contrast to an inferior good. With an inferior good, like a crappy frozen dinner, demand decreases when income increases, and demand increases when income decreases. So you guys, a lot of you, are obviously students living on maybe fixed incomes, and you're willing to buy crappy food sometimes because you're just trying to make it through the week, right? You have a small budget, and you're gonna buy whatever you're gonna buy to fill your stomach so you can get through the week and eventually, you know, graduate from college, find a job that'll pay you a decent salary, and as your salary goes up, you're going to buy less of crappy frozen dinners, right? So it's an inferior good. Your income goes up, you buy less of the crappy frozen dinner. Now there isn't a hard and fast rule that says frozen dinners have to be inferior goods. It's just a matter of perspective. If you consider it an inferior good, meaning that as your income goes up, you buy less of it, then to you it is an inferior good. But the word inferior should not be taken to mean that there's something inherently inferior about the product. It's a matter of perspective. Other people may buy more crappy frozen dinners as their income goes up because they happen to love crappy frozen dinners. So it's just a matter of perspective. Like, again, people anyway, that's it. We're done. So this is the end of this part of the video that I re-recorded, and then from this point forward, it's going to cut to the video that I did record in class once I got my power back onto the computer. Sorry about the delay, folks. It won't happen again. And have a great one. Bye-bye. All right, again, we're talking about things that will shift the entire demand relationship, right? We talked about the relationship between the good we're thinking about and related goods, right? Complements and substitutes. Now we talked about income. Income can change the demand of a good, either shifted to the right or the left, depending on whether people view the good as a normal good or an inferior good. As incomes go up, demand will go up for normal goods, so that'll shift the demand curve to the right, increase demand. Whereas if it's an inferior good, incomes go up, demand goes down, so then the demand curve will shift to the left. Demand will decrease. Another factor that can affect demand is changes in taste, what people think about certain things that they buy. So tastes and preferences are subjective and vary amongst consumers, right? Like you have your own taste, I have my own taste. Economists usually lump together changes in demand due to fads, beliefs, cultural shifts, and so on under the heading of change in taste and preferences. Advertising can usually have an effect on that. When tastes change in favor of a good, more people will want to buy it at any given price, so the demand curve shifts to the right. If, like you think about our society, people have become more conscious about like fuel efficiency, and thus people are more willing to maybe like ride bicycles to wherever they're going. So at any given price, over time, demand for bicycles has increased, right? So demand has shifted to the right because tastes have changed with respect to what people feel about bicycles and their usefulness. When tastes change against a good, fewer people want to buy it at any given price, so demand curve shifts to the left. Demand decreases. All right, the fourth main shifter of demand is changes in expectations. What do people expect to happen in the future? If you buy a lot of something, like some type of maybe clothing, something that's of interest to you, but the price is definitely something that affects your ability to buy it or not. If you know the price is going to go down in the future, you'll buy less of it today and buy more of it in the future. So demand will decrease today if you expect the price of something to increase in the future, and vice versa. If you expect the price to go up of, let's say, gasoline tomorrow, you'll buy more gasoline today. So demand will increase for gasoline because you expect price to change in the future. So again, if consumers have a choice about the timing of a purchase, they buy according to their expectations. Buyers adjust current spending in anticipation of the direction of future prices in order to obtain the lowest possible price. So again, for gasoline, if you expect prices to go up tomorrow, you're going to increase your demand for gasoline at any given price today. So demand will shift to the right. It will increase. And finally, a change in the number of consumers, essentially the population. So as the population of an economy changes, the number of buyers of a particular good also change, thereby changing demand. So right now we've got the baby boom generation, the generation that came after World War II, where a lot of people died, and so when people came back, they're like, we need more people. So they made a lot more people, and then those people, grew up, and now they're retiring. So if you think about the market for medical services, older people need to use a doctor more, right? So demand will increase, shift to the right at any given price for medical services because, again, there's just more people that are buying it because the population has increased. All right, let me highlight the difference between an individual's demand and the market demand curve. So the individual demand curve represents an individual. It illustrates the relation between quantity demanded and the price for an individual consumer. The market demand curve shows how the combined quantity demanded by all consumers depends on the market price of the good. You can use individual demand curves to get to the market demand curve. Let me show you how. Generally, when economists refer to the demand curve, when we're talking about the demand curve in general, we're always talking about the market demand curve, not the individual demand curve. So let's say there's a person named Darla. We're talking about the market for blue jeans. This is her individual demand curve. It represents her willingness to buy jeans at any given price. At $2, she'll buy 20 jeans. At $1, she'll buy 30 jeans. Then you've got Dino. Dino also buys jeans. He has an individual demand for jeans at various prices. At $2, he'll buy 10 pairs of jeans. At $1, he'll buy 20 pairs of jeans. To combine them into the market demand curve, we do what's called a horizontal summation across prices. So we look at any particular price and we say, how much are all consumers willing to buy at that price? We add them together and we get to the market demand curve. So Darla at $2, she'll buy 20 jeans. Dino at $2, he'll buy 10 jeans. So at $2, the market demand is 30. 20 plus 10 is 30. At $1, Darla will buy 30, Dino will buy 20, 30 plus 20 is 50. So at $1, our market demand curve, we see that 50 jeans will be demanded from the market. The market demand curve, again, is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves of all consumers in that market. All right, so that's the demand side. Let's turn to supply side. Supply has similar characteristics, but slightly different because we're talking about different intentions in the market, right? Like consumers are just looking to buy things at the lowest price. Suppliers are wanting to supply things at the highest price, right? Because they want to make the highest profit. So the supply curve represents the behavior of sellers. The supply curve shows the quantity supplied at various prices, much like the demand curve shows the quantity demanded at various prices. Quantity supplied is the actual amount of a good or service people are willing to sell at some specific price. The supply schedule shows how much of a good or service would be supplied at different prices. So it's a table, again, that's going to have prices and it's going to have quantity supplied corresponding to each price that suppliers are willing to sell at each of those prices. So here is a supply schedule for cotton, and we can plot all those points like we did with the demand curve to plot our supply curve. So here, the price of $2 per pound, suppliers are willing to supply 11.6 billion pounds of cotton. At 50 cents, they're willing to supply only 8 billion pounds of cotton. So in this case, as price decreases, quantity supply decreases, and as price increases, quantity supplied increases. So we're going to have a positive relationship between the price of the good and the quantity supplied of the good. So then the supply curve will have a positive slope versus a demand curve that has a negative slope. And this reflects the law of supply. A higher price for a good or service, other things equal, leads suppliers to supply greater quantity of a good or service. Just intuitively makes sense, right? If you're selling, you can earn more money by selling more if the price is going up. But if the price is going down, you're going to want to sell less because it's just not worth it to you. So again, there's a distinction between a movement along the curve and a shift of the entire curve. So if we're moving along the curve, the only thing that's causing that is a change in price, and it basically reflects the fact that suppliers will supply less at various prices, right? So a movement along the curve is a change in the quantity supplied of a good arising from a change in the good's price. We say there's a change in quantity supplied with a movement along the supply curve. Like we said, there's a change in quantity demanded when there was a movement along the demand curve versus a shift of the entire curve. We said there was a change in demand. So if we're shifting the entire supply curve, then we say there's a change in supply. So shifts of the supply curve represent a change in the quantity supplied of a good or service at any given price. It's represented by the price of the original supply curve to a new position. It's represented by the change of the original supply curve to a new position. So here we've got a supply curve. Again, in this case, we're talking about coffee beans. A movement along the curve means that the price of coffee beans is changing, and that's changing the quantity supplied in that market. And it's not the same thing as a shift of the supply curve, which in this case represented an increase in supply or a decrease in supply if the curve has shifted to the left. And what it means is that at any given price, producers are willing to supply more. So price isn't changing how much they're willing to supply. Something else is affecting it. So an increase in supply is a shift to the right. A decrease in supply is a shift to the left. A movement along the curve is a change in quantity supplied, either an increase in quantity supplied or a decrease in quantity supplied. Gesundheit. All right, let's talk about the things that shift supply curves. So economists believe that shifts of the supply curve for a good or service are mainly the result of 5 factors, though I didn't mention it earlier, but even though the factors I mentioned are the main ones, there can be anything that can affect demand as there can be anything that can affect supply, but these are the main ones that we talk about in these courses. All right, so I'll just list them and then I'll go through them individually. Changes of input prices, the cost of the things that you use to produce. Changes in the price of related goods or services. If you're a producer and you produce things that are related, it's going to affect your decision to produce one or the other if prices are changing in either of the goods markets. Changes in technology, your ability to produce, like if you're producing by hand versus a machine, if you're using a machine, you're going to produce more than by hand, so that's going to lower your cost, you're going to increase your supply. Changes in expectations, what you expect to happen to prices in your market in the future. Changes in the number of producers, how many producers are on the market. All right, so changes in input prices, we talked about the factors of production in the last chapter, the things that are used to produce. Labor, people, right? That's one important factor of production. There's also, of course, capital. There's human capital. There's the skills and knowledge that you are gaining while you're here getting your education. If there's more human capital, more knowledge, that's generally going to reduce costs. There's physical capital, like machines and buildings, which we just call capital generally. If you increase the amount of capital, then generally you'll be able to supply more at a lower price, so that'll increase supply. So an input is a good or service that is used to produce another good or service. An increase in the price of an input makes the production of the final good more costly for those who produce and sell it. So let's say the minimum wage goes up. That means that suppliers have to pay their workers more. That means that at any given price, they're going to want to supply less. That means supply curve will shift to the left. Supply will decrease, and vice versa. Another factor that affects supply, that is changes in the price of related goods or services. So there are substitutes and complements in the production process as well. An oil refiner will supply less gasoline at any given price when the price of heating oil rises, shifting the supply curve for gasoline to the left, and vice versa. And that is because they are substitutes in production. An oil refiner can produce both gasoline and heating oil. If the price of heating oil goes up, they're going to want to supply less gasoline and focus more of their production resources on producing heating oil. So they will substitute away from gasoline. That means that the supply of gasoline will decrease. And so the supply curve, which is upward sloping, will shift to the left. Supply will decrease. Again, this means that gasoline and other co-produced products are substitutes in the production for refiners. Other goods can be complements in production, though, meaning that as you produce more of one, you'll produce more of the other. So producers of natural gas often find that natural gas wells also produce oil as a byproduct of extraction. So let's say the price of natural gas goes up. That means quantity supplied of natural gas will increase. What that also means is that at any given price in the oil market, producers will supply more. So supply will increase in the oil market. All right, another of the main shifters of supply is changes in technology. So like I mentioned, industrial revolutions in a couple of classes already. We've had big industrial revolutions over the last 2 centuries, starting with the invention of automation via steam power and then electrical power, the internal combustion engine, the steam engine that came before it, the invention of steel. These things helped us to produce more per unit of time. And so when that happens, your costs go down. And thus, when technology increases, that tends to increase supply because it tends to lower costs. So new, better technologies make sellers willing to offer more at any given price or sell their quantity at a lower price. A technological innovation lowers costs and increases supply. Fourth thing, changes in expectations. Just like if you're a buyer of a good and you expect the price of the good to go up next year, you're going to buy more of that good today, so demand increases as a result. If you're the seller of a good and you expect the price to go up next year, you're going to want to sell more next year rather than today. So today, your supply will decrease, right? So here's a supply curve. It will shift to the left. It will decrease at any given price. So again, the expectation of a higher price for a good in the future decreases current supply of the good if they can store the good, and vice versa. So gasoline and other oil products are often stored for significant periods of time at oil refineries before being sold to consumers because generally the suppliers of gas know that they'll be able to sell it more in the future. Knowing that the demand for gasoline peaks in the summer, oil refiners normally store some of their gasoline produced during the spring for summer sale. And finally, changes in the number of producers. So if there are profits to be made in an industry, then more firms will enter that industry if it's a competitive market, and they will supply more of the good at any given price. And so supply will increase. So like when the first sort of HD TV was invented, there was only like 1 or 2 suppliers of that. Eventually, everybody kind of reverse engineered the technology and made their own version of it. Maybe some of them improved it to like plasma technology or whatever. Supply increased in the television market as a result. So it's a positively sloped line. At any given price, it shifted to the right, supply increased. So as producers enter and exit the market, the overall supply changes. There's also a distinction between the individual supply curve and the market supply curve. And again, you can aggregate, combine, get to the market supply curve by doing horizontal summation across prices. So here's Mr. Silva. He's willing to supply coffee, $2. He'll supply 3 units, $1, only 1 unit. Well, they're pounds. Mr. Liu, $2. He'll supply 2 pounds, $1. He'll supply 1 pound. So these are individual supply curves illustrating the relationship between quantity supplied and the price for an individual producer. To get to the market supply curve, again, you look at any particular price and say, well, how much does each individual supply at that price? Then you add those together to get to the market supply. So at $2, Mr. Silva supplied 3 pounds. Mr. Liu supplied 2 pounds. At $2 for the market, we add 3 plus 2, which is 5. So $2, the market supply is 5 units, 5 pounds of coffee. So again, the market supply curve shows how the combined total quantity supplied of all individual producers in the market depends on the market price of that good. All right, now let's throw both of these together and get to what's called the equilibrium for the market. So in chapter 1, we learned the general principle that markets move toward equilibrium, a situation in which no individual will be better off taking a different action. So a competitive market is in equilibrium when the prices move to a level at which the quantity of the good demanded equals the quantity of the good supplied. So it establishes what's called an equilibrium price, also known as the market clearing price. It's the price that matches the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. and it also establishes an equilibrium quantity, the quantity bought and sold at the equilibrium price. All right, so let's talk about finding the equilibrium price and quantity. So here is our negatively sloped, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, right? Reflecting the law of demand. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Upward sloping supply curve reflecting the law of supply. As price goes up, quantity supplied goes up, right? Where they meet is the point at which quantity supplied exactly equals quantity demanded. If you're not at that point, then market forces will drive us to that point. So if we are above the equilibrium, say at 150, you're going to get a lot more supply than demand. So you're going to have what's called a surplus. I'll go over this again in a second. When you have more supply than demand, you have a lot of supply just remaining on the shelves because nobody's buying it. So then suppliers start to lower their prices. As they lower their prices, more people are willing to buy, eventually getting us to this point. If the price is below the equilibrium, then demand outweighs supply, and so you have a shortage. There's too much demand and not enough to go around. When that happens, and there's only a few of the good being sold, all the people that are looking to buy will start bidding up the price. They'll start saying, well, I'm willing to pay more than what you're charging, and then they'll start competing against each other. And then as they do that, more suppliers enter the market, and then eventually it gets us to the equilibrium. So regardless of whether you're at the top or the bottom of the equilibrium price, what's called market forces describing what I just talked about as far as that behavior, will drive the markets back to equilibrium. It will always get them back to the point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So we can be sure the market will arrive at the equilibrium price by answering the following three simple questions. Why do all sales and purchases in a market take place at the same price? Well, there are some markets where the same good can sell for many different prices depending on who is selling and who is buying. In any market where the buyers and sellers have been around for some time, sales and purchases tend to converge at a generally uniform price, so we can safely talk about the market price. So if the market hasn't been around for a long time, there's only a few sellers, then you might go to one seller, they'll tell you one price. You might go to another seller, they'll tell you a different price. But if over time enough people are selling and there's enough buyers, then you will get a competitive situation in which the market will set a price and people will not want to buy at different prices. They'll know where to get that lowest price. And so everybody will have to sell at the lowest price, because if they don't, they'll be out of the market. Second question, why does the price fall if it's above the equilibrium price? Like I already mentioned, when you are above the equilibrium, you're going to have a surplus, and that's when quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. Surpluses occur when the price is above its equilibrium level. So again, let's say we're at $1.50. In this case, quantity demanded is 8.1. Quantity supplied is going to equal 11.2. So we have that surplus there, the difference between the two, which is about 3.1 in this case. And so when that happens, like I said, suppliers will start lowering their prices. So on the demand side, what the curve represents is a willingness to pay. So there's some people over here that will pay a high amount, and there's people down here that are only willing to pay a low amount. So as the price goes down, these people that were not willing to pay at $1.50 and weren't willing to buy start to enter the market, start to buy. And then suppliers that were willing to supply up here, when the price starts to go down, they actually start to leave the market, because what this represents is like their cost of supplying. So if the price starts to go below what they need to incur as far as cost to produce something, then they can't afford to produce it. So they'll drop out of the market. So all these folks will drop out of the market when the price falls, and then quantity demanded will equal quantity supplied. And the other side of the coin is when the price is below equilibrium. Like I mentioned, why does the market rise if it is below the equilibrium price? So you have a shortage when the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Shortages occur when the price is below its equilibrium level. So in this case, if the price is 75 cents and quantity supplied is 9.1 and quantity demanded is 11.5, you're going to have a shortage in this case of about 2.4. In that case, these folks over here who value the good more and are willing to pay more will start bidding up the price.
these suppliers over here that were not selling at this low price will now sell as the price goes up because their costs are being met. So they'll enter the market, and that'll get us back to the equilibrium level. So the market price will always rise if it is below the equilibrium level in a competitive market. All right, let's talk about what happens to the equilibrium when there are changes in supply and changes in demand, right? Those things that we talked about that shift the curves. When that happens, if the market is in equilibrium, it's going to get it out of equilibrium, and it's going to send it to a new equilibrium. So you need to just be able to identify what happens in the market when either the supply curve shifts or the demand curve shifts. What happens to the equilibrium price? What happens to the equilibrium quantity? So what happens when the demand curve shifts? So here we are in equilibrium. Let's say there's an increase in demand and demand shifts to the right. So at this initial equilibrium, let's say incomes went up. So at any given price, people are willing to buy more because they make more money. So demand has increased. When that happens, we're at this initial equilibrium. At the old price, the quantity supplied is going to be Q1, but the quantity demanded is going to be more, right? So there's going to be a shortage because demand has shifted. When there's a shortage, we know that market forces will drive the price up, and so therefore the market will move to this new equilibrium point. So at the original market price of P1, the market is no longer in equilibrium. A shortage occurs because the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So the price rises and generates an increase in the quantity supplied and upward movement along the supply curve. So there has been an increase in demand, and since there was nothing affecting supply, and we just moved up along the supply curve because the equilibrium price went up and led to an increase in quantity supplied, we know that on the supply side, quantity supplied increased. So demand increased, that caused quantity supply to increase, that caused our equilibrium price to go up, that caused our equilibrium quantity to increase. So whenever demand goes up, that will always lead to an increase in price and a decrease in quantity, the equilibrium quantity. Whenever demand goes down, that will lead to a decrease in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. So the sequence of events reflects a general principle. Like I said, when the demand for a good or service increases, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of the good or service both rise, and vice versa. Also, when the demand for a good or service decreases, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of the good or service both drop. What happens when the supply curve shifts? So again, let's say you're at equilibrium, and there's an equilibrium price and quantity. The market is where it needs to be. Quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. All of a sudden, there's a decrease in supply. We know that wages went up, incomes went up. So that means that it costs more for producers to supply at any given price. So before they were willing to supply this much but now that their costs have gone up, they're only willing to supply this much at this price. And that happens at all the prices. So supply decreases, shifts the supply to the left. So initially we were at this equilibrium here. When supply decreased, what happened was that you had this amount of demand and this amount of supply. So there's going to be a what now? A shortage. Yes, there's going to be a shortage, right? And because there's a shortage, these folks are going to start to bid up the price, and these suppliers will supply more, and then we will get to that new equilibrium. So when supply goes down, equilibrium price will increase, but equilibrium quantity will decrease. And on the demand side, because we just moved up along the demand curve and quantity demanded went down, we say that quantity demanded decreased, right? We don't say that demand decreased, we say quantity demanded decreased on the demand side because we just moved up along the demand curve as the supply, the decrease in supply caused an increase in the price, which then caused quantity demanded to decrease. So at the original price, P1, a shortage exists in the market, as I already mentioned. The shortage causes a rise in the price. The new equilibrium with an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity is at this point here. In the new equilibrium, the price is higher and the equilibrium quantity is lower than before. This can be stated as a general principle. When the supply of a good or service decreases, the equilibrium price of the good or service rises and the equilibrium quantity of the good or service decreases. Now, when you have simultaneous shifts of both curves, when something is happening on both sides of the market, it's not as clear-cut what's going to happen to equilibrium price and quantity. And so you need to just be able to do this analysis, like draw out the curves for yourself and then figure out what's happening. And I'll show you why it's unclear right now. So it sometimes happens that the events shift both the demand and supply curves at the same time. The resulting effect on the market is not as clear-cut as when only one curve shifts. So let's say that demand increased and that supply decreased, right? Like the amount that the curve shifts is arbitrary. It's random. Like nobody said they should shift by, a certain amount, half an inch, 2 inches, whatever. It's just increase or decrease. So because of that, you shift the curve and it gets you to some new equilibrium. So we increase the demand, we decrease supply. That got us to this new equilibrium here that led to an increase in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. In this case, the demand dominated the increase in supply. But let's say that the same thing happened, but the curves shifted maybe a little bit less or a little bit more. So like supply shifts a little bit more than it did before, and demand only shifts a little bit. Demand still increased and supply still decreased. But in this case, the equilibrium price still went up. So it's clear that no matter how much we shift the curves, that equilibrium price will go up. But we see that in this case, equilibrium quantity has actually decreased, whereas before, equilibrium quantity had actually increased. And so what that tells us is that what happens to the equilibrium quantity as a result of an increase in demand and a decrease in supply is unclear. We don't know. We can't say for sure. We do know for sure that it will lead to a raise in the price. But we do not know what will actually happen to equilibrium quantity. It's all dependent on what's actually happening in the market and how much these curves are actually shifting, which you don't know when you're doing this kind of just like graphical analysis. So you need to just be able to understand that if you're asked to analyze what's happening when two different curves are shifting. You could draw it out for yourself, have both curves shift, and then draw another version where you shift the curves a little more, a little bit less, and then identify which one of the two variables is unclear as far as like whether it's going up or down. All right, and this table here, which is going to be in the slides, just kind of sums up what could happen with an increase in demand. You don't have to memorize the table, but it's just a guide to sort of tell you what could happen. And then finally, just a mention about competitive markets and other markets. Like I mentioned, competitive markets aren't the only type of markets that exist. So let me just get through this. It's 2 slides. Even if it takes me 1 more minute, just give it to me, please. I would appreciate it. To understand why competitive markets are different from other markets, compare the problem facing 2 individuals. You have a wheat farmer who has to decide whether to grow more wheat, and the president of Alcoa, a giant aluminum company. For the wheat farmer who functions in a competitive market, the question is simply whether the extra wheat can be sold at a price high enough to justify extra production costs. The farmer doesn't have to worry about whether producing more wheat will affect the price of the wheat, or he or she was already planning to grow. Because again, like I said, in a competitive market, everybody sells the same wheat. Everybody's selling at the same price. You can't change the price that's being sold. So there are thousands of wheat farmers, and no one farmer's decision will have any impact on the market price. For the Alcoa executive, things are not that simple because aluminum is not a competitive market. There are only a few big producers, including Alcoa, and each of them is well aware that its actions do have a noticeable impact on the market price, which we'll talk about at the end of the course. Alcoa can't decide whether or not to produce more aluminum just by saying they'll produce additional product. The company also has to ask whether producing more aluminum will drive down the market price and reduce their profit. So they have to consider not just what they're doing, but what their competitors are doing. So when a market is competitive, individuals can base decisions on less complicated analysis than those used in a non-competitive marketplace. These are just ideas that are laying a foundation for your understanding of very in-depth analysis that we're going to do in the second and last part of the course. But beyond that, we are done with Chapter 2. Congratulations. So again, I will post today's files online within a day. I'll open up the homework, which will be due the middle of the next week. Beyond that, have a great weekend. I'll see you next week. If you're trying to get into the course, make sure you sign in.